He scraped ash along a page edge and found letters that refused to stay black. Suspicion tightened his jaw as the occult researcher pressed a thumb to the charred paper and watched heat lift a faint line of erased ink. He had not expected a manuscript to survive the courtyard blaze, nor had he expected scorch marks arranged with the exact geometry of a sigil. The discovery was immediate and physical. Half a page, charcoal black, edges fused. The central columns erased in a pattern that did not belong to accident. Suspicion drove his hands. He moved faster, as if speed might outrun the implication. He set his brass monocle on the page and tapped the monocle chain against his palm. The researcher is methodical by habit. He slides a small bone-handled stylus along the margin. He lights a single candle, the flame steady against dusk wind. He is 45, lean, with iron black hair threaded with grey, and a long thin scar along his left eyebrow that tightens when he concentrates. He smells cold incense and hot metal from his tools. The courtyard is full of ash and collapsed shelving. Broken tablets lean like teeth in a jaw. What did you find? The archivist apprentice from under a collapsed stone archway. The apprentice's voice is quick, clipped, and edged with the impatience of someone who has been searching all night. What did you find, researcher? He repeated a page. The researcher, half a ledger, scorched deliberately. He slid his hand under a burned corner and lifted. Char soot flaked onto his palm. He felt the sting of heat that had long since left the stone, but lingered in the grain of the leather binding. He kept his voice low. Suspicion is not a mood for shouting. They worked while dusk bled into night. The researcher applied a careful rubbing with treated linen and a weak heat test that the silent archivist had once taught in a tone that never finished sentences. The rubbing revealed a pattern of excision. Letters removed in a ritual geometry that matched the courtyard's scorch marks. The apprentice set down a candle and tapped a series of notes into a small slate. This is not random burning. The archivist apprentice. Look at the arcs here, researcher. The scorch follows a sequence I've seen only in ritual annulments. He pointed with a charcoal-stained finger. Show me the sequence. The researcher. He watched the apprentice slide finger along the margin. The apprentice's hands trembled with the tiredness of long nights and the pressure of discovery. They worked until a cold wind pushed embers across the courtyard. An elongated silhouette watched from the ruined archway, the silent archivist. She did not step into the light. She held the wax-sealed ledger at her hip. Her fingers were ink, stained and chipped. She did not speak. Her breath came in shallow, precise pulls. The researcher recognized duty in the way she kept her head angled toward the page, but did not touch it. Her presence turned the discovery into accusation. Archivist, the researcher, why are the core columns gone? His voice asked the interim question that a ledger cannot answer. She approached and set a palm near the manuscript without touching. Her breath smelled of damp stone and sealing wax. They did not burn it by mistake, she said in a voice that rasped like paper edges. They designed the burn to hide a sentence. The researcher felt an emotion shift. Suspicion had slid into dread. He tightened his grip on the stylus until a small crack of ceramic sounded. He could map the practical consequences. If a sentence was excised by ritual, the ledger had been altered to shape forgetting itself. He forced himself to name the consequence aloud. Someone made memory a process, council procedure. The silent archivist, a pact. They moved to reconstruct in the makeshift tent. The researcher pinned the charcoal page under low heat and lifted ghost ink with a careful rubbing. He read aloud short words as they emerged. The apprentice recorded. The silent archivist watched the rubbing by the cold light of a lamp and kept a hand on her wax-sealed ledger. We seal a passage, we remove a name. The researcher, we make it unreadable on purpose. They did more than hide words, the silent archivist replied. She tapped the wax on her ledger, and the sound was like a fingernail against stone. They folded a vow into the binding. The researcher looked for the vow in the physicality of the ledger. He found a sewn strip under the leather, an extra fold that held a narrow parchment. He eased it free. The parchment had a list of names and a stamped oval seal. One name was marked with a cross and scorched circles around it. The apprentice exhaled sharply. "Council Elder," the apprentice said. "That's the mark of the ruling circle." They reconstructed the flashback using heat and rubbing as a machine of memory. In the result, the silent archivist and a ring of robed elders moved precisely. The researcher watched the reconstruction as if he were reading a transcribed scene. The silent archivist pressing a fingertip to a ledger, a council elder directing ink to be erased, a collective recitation that flattened a sentence into absence. The researcher heard the words the elders spoke in the rubbing, a phrase of renunciation and a clause of exclusion. He watched a hand cut letters with a blade and fold the strip into the binding. "We pledge unremembering." The council elder in the reconstruction. "We make the name unspoken." Council elder, the researcher aloud, naming the man he would later find among descendants. Naming served as a tool. The silent archivist did not correct him. They followed scorch patterns into the vault. The researcher forced open a sealed chest. A ward flashed in a thin blue flaring and made his teeth ache. The apprentice nearly stepped back. A ward of old design, reactive to touch, sparked and left a taste of iron in his mouth. "Ward is still live." The archivist apprentice. "Someone recast it recently." The researcher set a mittened hand on the chest rim and counted breaths. He used an old iron key the silent archivist produced from beneath her robe. The key fit with a slow, reluctant turn. The ward grumbled and then fell quiet as if someone had exhaled and stopped chanting. Inside were rows of boxes. One box had deliberate scorch marks on its lining. Inside that box lay a fragment sealed in wax. The fragment carried a smear of ink that had been deliberately rubbed to remove a name. The apprentice blinked and swallowed. They did not erase it centuries ago. The researcher. "This was done recently." They traced the wax trail across the courtyard to the sealed stone chamber. A ribbon of fresh sealing wax lay in a tight pattern, and a new scorch ring half burned into the flagstones. They forced the chamber door and found an altar cleared of a ledger and dust disturbed as if someone had left in a hurry. The cold blue light from inside the ajar door cut across their faces. They found footprints in the thin layer of ash. The researcher crouched and measured tread depth with a gloved finger. The prints were small and circular in pattern, not the heavy foot of an elder, but the agile step of someone used to moving between stacks. He recorded the tread pattern in a folded note. The ledger left recently. The researcher, someone removed it less than a week ago. They followed the trail to a ruined colonnade where he found a council elder descendant. He called him by name, Council Elder Marrows. The man had a narrow nose and eyes that shifted like a ledger on a table when guilt leaned near. "Marrows, the researcher. You carry the council sink in your household. Where did the ledger go?" Marrows wiped dust from a ring in his hand. His voice came soft and precise. "I know of a fragment. I know of a sealed piece. I do not know of the rest." His fingers moved as if messaging a memory he was trying to anchor. The researcher pressed harder. "You pledged the unremembering. Your line bears the seal." "Marrows, tell me where you placed it." Marrows looked at the researcher and then at the silent archivist. His mouth tightened. "We promised the city peace." The ledger carried a truth that would have broken it. "I will not speak the truth and rend the city anew." A second emotion shift occurred inside the researcher. Dread shifted into a harder, resolving strain. He felt his jaw set and his posture straighten. He did not accept moral calculus that hid facts from history. "You promised to forget a truth that belonged to everyone," he said. His tone contained a decision. Marrows stepped back and flinched. "You would not understand, researcher. You are not one of us. I am one who reads what remains." The researcher replied, "I am one who asks why a ledger is altered." They argued in the ruined colonnade. The researcher and Marrows traded sharp lines while the silent archivist kept watch. The argument had heat. It had 3 exchanges in which the council elder as descendant tried to shut the researcher down and the researcher pressed for names and dates. "Marrows, the researcher. Name the ritual architect." "Marrows, you cannot take what we have sacrificed." He stepped forward, then stopped. "We sealed the ledger for safety." "Safety for whom?" "The researcher, for the living. Marrows, for those who remained." The researcher left with new evidence and a narrowed lead. The ledger had been removed recently, and carried a name the council had buried. He and the apprentice returned to the tent and spread the sealed fragment before the lamp. The fragment smelled of wax and a faint whiff of citrus from sealing balm. The researcher set the fragment beside his worn leather grimoire and opened the grimoire to compare script. He worked through the night. The silent archivist stood at the tent flap, hands folded over her wax-sealed ledger. She did not enter, but she did not leave either. Her presence was a continual constraint. The researcher felt the ritual's logic pressing downward. Someone had chosen to omit a truth because that truth would unmake a social order. By midnight they had decoded a stitch pattern in the binding that signaled a vow folded into the ledger. The apprentice read aloud the reconstructed clause in short, clipped phrases: "The named shall be unspoken. The named shall be made absent." He paused between lines to breathe and to avoid swallowing words that would feel like confession. Who is the named? The researcher. They did not find a complete name in the sealed fragment. They found partial syllables and a loop of glyph that matched names registered in tax ledgers. The researcher felt the pressure of a mid-chapter revelation. He had a breadcrumb. The name was not erased centuries ago. It was purposefully removed, and then the ledger was hidden and resealed. Someone in the present had acted to finish the job. At pre-dawn they followed the fresh trail to the sealed stone chamber again. The blue light behind the ajar door was colder now. The researcher forced the door with the iron key, and the silent archivist moved inside without a step, as if she owned the floor plan of guilt. The room smelled of cold stone and an almost imperceptible hum like held breath. Within, the altar was bare but for a ring of crushed wax, and an imprint where a ledger had rested. The dust had been recently disturbed, and an edge of leather had left a smear. The researcher reached into the smear and felt the tack of fresh resin. He lifted a small wax-sealed parcel from under the altar cloth. It was light, this is it. The researcher, this must be what they removed. The silent archivist took the parcel with her ink-stained fingers and set it on the altar. She opened the seal with deliberate motions and then hesitated. Her breath made a millimeter of sound in the room. "It will cost you a detail," she said. "What do you mean?" The researcher. She did not answer with a definition. She answered with a display. She rubbed her ink-stained fingertips over the parcel, and a small smear of dark residue touched the researcher's knuckle. He felt a sudden pull at the corner of his memory, the sensation of a syllable slipping away. His stomach tightened, and the words of a child's lullaby that he had memorized in his youth blurred at the edge. He tried to name it. He reached for a concrete anchor. The name of the place where he had once stored an old ledger in his childhood house. He could not place the second syllable. His fingers crawled over the grimoire and his handwriting faltered for a moment. The experience registered physically. His throat dried, his fingers clenched. The silent archivist watched his hand and did not conceal the small, steady cruelty of the ritual. "You can take the ledger fragment," she said. "You can attempt to read it. But a detail will leave you. We consecrated the erasure so that retrieval costs a concrete fact of your life." "Who authorized that?" the researcher demanded. She met his eyes and named a time and a ceremony: the council. The ritual was enacted under Elder Maros' ancestor and renewed by his line. Did they intend to take memory from the living? The researcher. They intended to prevent the truth from scattering and creating violence, she said. Her voice contained quiet exhaustion, not an excuse. The researcher considered the bargain. An emotion shift occurred. Resolve hardened into the willingness to accept loss for the sake of truth. He extended his hand and took the sealed fragment. He felt the wax cool against his palm. He thought, if a single detail must go, better it be a trivial personal fact than the ledger's core. They left the chamber with a single sealed fragment and a smear of ink clinging to his glove. On the walk back, the apprentice kept up a stream of factual questions. "What will we do with it?" he asked. "Do we open it now?" "We will open it when we can contain the cost." The researcher. "We will document everything before we read a line." They chose a single sealed fragment rather than a full ledger. The researcher made the choice by action. He wrapped the fragment in treated linen, bound it with cord, and placed his obstinate signet ring against the seal to mark custody. The apprentice nodded and set a watch over it. The silent archivist touched the bundle and then slid away into the ruined stacks without turning back. Back at the tent, the researcher sat to ink a note about what he remembered. The smear of ink on his glove caught the candlelight and seemed to eat a name from his immediate past. He wrote in short, precise sentences about dates, locations, and the scorched geometry they had mapped. Each sentence was a physical act of recording. Each line acted as an anchor against the ritual's claim. He wrote the names he could recall. Maros, silent archivist, archivist apprentice. He left a space where another name should be and circled it. The chapter ends on a precise action. He folds the note, places it into the leather grimoire, and slips the sealed fragment into the grimoire's inner pocket. As he closes the grimoire, he feels a small throb at the edge of a fact that has gone. The name of a street where his mother once argued with a council scribe. He does not reach for it. Instead, he ties a small red thread around the grimoire's strap and vows, through the action of binding, to follow the breadcrumb intentionally left beyond reach. Outside the tent flap, the silent archivist stands at the threshold and does not enter. Her shoulders slope in a way that holds both duty and restraint. She lifts the iron key and turns it in her fingers once. The researcher looks up and meets her gaze. Then he returns to cataloging the evidence. He cannot yet know whether the ledger protects the city or destroys its people. He knows only that he has a fragment, a cost paid in the body's forgetting, and a thin trail that leads toward a decision made long ago and enacted again in secret. For now, the immediate conflict is resolved. They retrieved a fragment, proved the excision was ritual, and discovered the ledger was removed recently. The researcher closes the grimoire, places the sealed fragment within, and snaps the clip shut. The last line of the chapter is not reflection but a small, tangible event. A knock at the tent's rear flap, the sound measured and 3 beats long, that suggests another presence, and another choice is near emotion root. Suspicion, emotion shifts. Suspicion, dread resolve. He levered the iron bar under the lintel and felt the brittle seal crack beneath his fingers, then drew out a wax disc stamped with the outline of a book that did not exist. Suspicion tightened his jaw. Suspicion had driven him down into passageways no living counselor wanted reopened. The occult researcher wiped grit from the wax with the corner of his coat and held the impression to the light. An absent spine, an empty title, a blank where a ledger's seal should name a keeper. He did not speak. He did not move to celebrate. He pressed the seal to his palm and remembered the charred folio from the courtyard, the page he had scraped ash along and watched letters lift like reluctant dye. That surface memory from the burned ledger, the scraped edge with its faint, unwilling line of erased ink, had sent him here. The immediate problem was concrete. The city had not merely lost its book, it had marked absence and sealed that absence as a deliberate act. He thumbed the seal again. Suspicion shifted into a softer doubt when he heard footsteps above, slower, careful. He whispered, "Stay back," and the acolyte froze at the stair mouth, fingers white around the iron rail. The acolyte's face was lean and young. The acolyte had been with the research team since they found the courtyard scorch marks. "You brought the lamp." The occult researcher. The acolyte answered, "Lamp and rope," and set the coil by the arch. He watched the occult researcher for a long heartbeat, then stepped down with weight measured. The concrete stakes were visible. A wax seal with an impossible impression, a burned page earlier refusing to yield words, and now a scent of sealing wax and limestone that filled the antechamber. That scent made the occult researcher's hands clamp tighter on the seal. They moved deeper. The corridor walls shed flakes of mortar under the lamp glow. The occult researcher kept his voice low but steady as he gave orders. 2 torches, stay right. Test the floor every step, he spoke like a scholar issuing directions. But his commands were shaped by suspicion and by the memory of ash and cured ink he had touched higher up. The acolyte answered with short confirmations. They passed a niche where a brass plate had been wrenched free. Fresh tool marks made the occult researcher's stomach tighten into a different feeling, an edged fear that this place had been searched recently. A cold wind threaded the passage and carried a thin metallic tang. He remembered the ledger in the archive courtyard, the way heat had lifted a faint line of ink into legibility for one brief instant. That memory applied pressure now. If the ledger had been protected from fire and later hidden, someone here had rehearsed disappearance. The occult researcher's next actions were governed by a mix of suspicion and obligation. He wanted proof that the omission had been ritualized, not accidental. He wanted to prove that the city had chosen to erase its central truth. They reached the antechamber proper. A stone door rose from the floor, rimed with salt and half, hidden under collapse. The occult researcher set the seal beside the hinge and wiped his palms on his coat hem. He pressed the iron key the acolyte had produced to his palm and felt its cold weight. The key's teeth were crude, hammered by hand and blunted by long use. It matched the hairline cracks in the wax impression. The occult researcher paused. Doubt folded into irritation at himself. He had come here because the confession in the courtyard, partially burned and yet stubborn, had suggested design, not accident. He tapped the seal against the stone and found the same iconography as on the courtyard ledger's margin. A blank book and 3 radial cuts, a sign he had seen once in a marginalia note naming a ritual, the Pact of Oblivion. The phrase aloud, testing the sound, Pact of Oblivion. The acolyte repeated, quiet, the occult researcher. He crouched and inserted the key. The mechanism resisted for a long count. Sweat beaded at his temple though the air was cold. He turned the key and felt pins grind into a long, unused channel. The door protested with a screech of stone, then settled into a slow, reluctant opening. They found a stone stair folded into the darkness. The lamplight skimmed ancient dust and the edges of sealed jars. The air changed, drier now, lined with the tang of old wax and pressed leather. The occult researcher descended with methodical steps. His curiosity pushed him. His suspicion kept him careful. On the 3rd stair, the acolyte halted and dug at a seam with a gloved thumb. There is writing underneath, the acolyte, under plaster. A note. The occult researcher leaned close. The acolyte brushed away grit and unveiled a strip of parchment, brittle but intact. The parchment bore a single sentence in a cramped hand. Choose oblivion if the truth will unmake us. Below the line, a name, the silent archivist. The occult researcher straightened so fast the lamp rocked. Show me. The acolyte passed the parchment up. The letters were spattered with old wax and bore the archivist's tiny ink, stained fingerprints that matched descriptions from the reconstructed records. He felt the first real fear then, fear that the ledger's erasure had been an act of preservation by destruction. They reached the vault foot. A carved threshold lay between them and a low dumb chamber. The threshold carried incised sigils filled with a black residue. The acolyte knelt to trace them. These sigils bind words to silence. The acolyte murmured, "My father said they were used when rulers feared what truth could do." The father's name long dead, then shut his jaw and looked at the occult researcher. The occult researcher traced the same sigils with a gloved finger. He remembered the burned ledger. The ash-scraped edge that had revealed letters that refused to stay black. That past discovery changed his intent. If the ledger is bound by design, opening it will trigger what they intended. We must be ready for a defense not of locks but of erasure. He set his jaw and ordered, "One light inside. Keep the door between us and the corridor until I say otherwise." They did not have much time. He had already felt the shift in alarm, steps above, then voices, a group moving through the archive corridors. The temple warden's gait was familiar from the reconstructed lists. A man who wore authority-like armor. The occult researcher did not want a confrontation, but he also would not abandon the trail. The next event arrived as a heavy knock on the vault approach. 3 dull raps that echoed in the stairwell. A voice called, "Hold fast, temple warden here." "By order of the council, you will stand down." The occult researcher slid the seal into his pocket. "Tell them to wait," he said to the acolyte. "Tell them we are cataloguing fragile fragments." He kept his words flat so that the acolyte would repeat them without betraying urgency. The acolyte moved to the door and spoke through the crack. "Temple warden." The acolyte, We catalogue fragile fragments. We'll open when the proper ritual can be observed. The voice that answered was tight and official. Archivist's duty belongs to all of the city. Open nothing without the council envoy present. The occult researcher felt his fear recalibrate into anger at bureaucratic delay. He straightened, forced his hands to stop trembling, and set the lamp at the threshold. He whispered, "If the council envoy arrives, we will be observed. Their presence could prevent us from recording anything outside their control." The acolyte glanced at him, and then looked down at the seam of the doorway. They had one discovery left before the council could insist on ceremony. Beneath a false flagstone, the occult researcher found a folded packet wrapped in oilcloth. He pried at the seal and withdrew a letter, the ink faded but legible. His pulse tightened when he read the first line aloud. Silent archivist writes, "This ledger contains a conditional history. To record it is to weaponize the dead. Choose oblivion." He looked up. "This is not an accident. This is a decision." The acolyte's lips pressed thin. They heard more steps, closer now, voices that argued low and hard. The temple warden's tone carried through the stair. "We reclaim what belongs to the order," someone answered with an envoyous, clipped cadence. "Reclaim with witnesses. We must prevent lawless removal." The occult researcher realized in a brittle instant that the conflict would become public. The omission was not only archival, it was political. They debated, short clipped lines exchanged in the dim. The occult researcher, "If the ledger is a weapon, then the city's order always weighed the ledger against itself." The acolyte touched his forearm. "We can take a rubbing." The acolyte suggested, "We can copy the margins and leave the physical ledger sealed." The occult researcher considered the plan and then shook his head once. "A rubbing will not show ritual defenses. If the ledger is designed to unwrite, we will lose our copies too." He spoke with the scholar's clarity, but the voice carried a near whisper of fear now. The temple warden arrived at the stair mouth with 3 claimants. He wore a heavy cloak threaded with institutional braid. The occult researcher held the confession letter tight under his coat. The warden's eyes found his shape in the doorway. "You there? Step into the light and surrender any materials taken from the archive," the warden commanded. The occult researcher stepped forward. "Temple warden," he said, "I am the occult researcher. I will comply with oversight if oversight permits me to document the ledger's context before anyone removes or seals it again." The warden's gaze narrowed. Occult researcher. The warden, naming him as if the name itself were an accusation. "The council chooses how memory is kept. You will not take what the city has deemed dangerous. Stand down." He planted his hands on the stone jamb and did not move. The acolyte, temple warden, "The letter says the silent archivist us to choose oblivion if the truth would unmake us." The warden's mouth tightened around a response. A council envoy, pale and exact, stepped forward and held a scroll. "Council envoy, the council will witness. None may extract alone." The thin man's voice was precise, as if performing a ritual of bureaucracy. The occult researcher felt another shift. Suspicion had become urgency, then fear. Now it slid into bargaining. He spoke fast. "Let the envoy see the seal. If the council recognizes the symbol, they will understand the ritual compact that bound this vault." The envoy inspected the wax disc through a magnifier. "This sign is restricted." The envoy slowly. "It is a binding mark used when a truth could dissolve authority. The Pact of Oblivion is recorded in minutes sealed from public reading. We must proceed with caution." The warden glanced at the envoy and then toward the stair. "Open only with a full council. No extraction tonight." He turned his face away as if to end the argument. The occult researcher reacted with abrupt action. He pressed the iron key into his palm and took one step toward the chamber. The warden reached for him. A short scuffle followed, 3 quick back and forth lines of command and refusal. "Temple warden, return the key." Occult researcher. "We can at least try to record margins." Temple warden. "You will not desecrate what binds us." The occult researcher jerked free and moved to the threshold. The acolyte grabbed his sleeve. In the next instant the key turned, the door ground. Inside, the chamber exhaled a sigh of cold air that carried a faint, bitter scent like sulfur and old paper. The ledger lay on a low stone slab, wrapped in linen and sealed with multiple wax stamps. Around it, tablets and a brass key lay scattered, their surfaces scratched. The occult researcher bent and set the lamp close. When he lifted the linen, ink began to blur at the edges of the top page, letters smeared inward like ink meeting water. He snapped the linen back. "It erases," he said, barely audible. The warden lunged for the slab and the envoy shouted for order. The occult researcher held up the wax seal. "Do not touch the pages until we understand the mechanism. This is not a simple cipher. This is a defense that unwrites," the envoy barked. "Bind them both. The council will decide." The silent archivist's voice entered the air, not physically, but as a memory the occult researcher had read in that confession under the flagstone. He read aloud, "To record is to weaponize. If this ledger names gods who can be toppled by knowledge, then the ledger becomes a trigger." His voice trembled while he said it. The acolyte kept glancing at the scattered tablets and the small brass key. The acolyte's fingers hovered over it, a visible tension. The warden forced the envoy's authority. He set 2 claimants to watch the door and ordered a ritual sealing ceremony before any removal. The occult researcher argued for a controlled test. "Temple warden, let me attempt a contained opening with the sigils traced and iron braced." The warden answered, "No. Council law forbids partial exposure." The argument became public. Voices rose and fell into terse exchanges. The debate grew heated, and in 3 rapid lines the warden, "You risk undoing us." The occult researcher shot back, "You risk protecting a lie that may unmake others." The envoy intervened with the council's phrase, "We will send for minutes. No action until morning." That decision should have ended the chapter. Instead it produced a twist. The acolyte whispered, "I helped seal this once. I was a child then. I can open the inner latch without moving the outer page." The occult researcher's head snapped toward him. "Acolyte, what did you say?" The acolyte swallowed and said, "I found I could close the book with my hands on its spine. I was told it was mercy." The confession changed everything. A collaborator among them. They argued again, this time with the acolyte's admission as leverage. Occult researcher, "Did you help?" The warden demanded. Acolyte, "I did. I did it because they told me to." Silent archivist, "Me, it would spare lives." The warden's face hardened into accusation. The envoy scribbled notes. The occult researcher registered betrayal. The feeling had a physical edge. His stomach tightened and his hands went ice cold. Suspicion folded into a deeper anger at human choice. They chose a compromise. The council envoy agreed to observe a partial ritual the next dawn if the occult researcher allowed 2 warden-appointed witnesses to remain. The occult researcher consented on one condition. He would remove and preserve fragments of the confession and smuggle a rubbing of the margin. The warden accepted, with a promise enforced by oath. They sealed the chamber with cord and wax and retreated to an antechamber for the night. Before they left, the occult researcher pried a thin scrap from the ledger's binding where the linen had frayed. He wrapped it in oilcloth and dropped it into his satchel next to the iron key and the wax seal. He could feel the weight of decisions pressing through his ribs. He and the acolyte moved away from the vault into the corridor, where the temple warden and the envoy argued quietly about procedure. At the corridor mouth, the occult researcher paused and lit a single candle from the lamp. He set the candle by the seal and sat on a low stone step. He read the confession aloud to the acolyte in measured lines. "Choose oblivion if the truth will unmake us." He read, "Silent archivist. I chose silence to keep them whole." The acolyte, nothing for a long moment. Then the acolyte, "I thought I had saved people. I think I helped bury something that could have set them free." The acolyte's voice broke against the stone. The occult researcher did not offer consolation. He catalogued the reaction as evidence. The acolyte's guilt proved motive. The warden's insistence proved institutional fear. The envoy's caution proved political control. Each reaction redirected his plan. His work now was not only to extract the ledger but to reckon with human choices that had consecrated a mission. They heard a distant bell, one toll for midnight, slow and formal. The warden looked at the occult researcher and said, "We reconvene at dawn." "Test nothing until then." The occult researcher nodded. He took the wax seal and slipped it into his pocket below the confession. He felt the object's ridges against his thigh like a basalt reminder. Outside, at the vault mouth, the acolyte touched the brass key that had sat among tablets. "We should hide this, the acolyte. We mustn't let the council control every memory." The occult researcher considered the proposition. He thought of the burned ledger in the courtyard and the letters that had surfaced under ash. He thought of the silent archivist's hand, ink-stained yet reluctant. He made a decision not driven by rhetoric but by a narrow calculation. Preserve evidence that proved intent, even if the ledger itself remained sealed. He wrapped the brass key in oilcloth and slid it into a hidden seam of his satchel. He did the same with the confession scrap. The acolyte watched and then pressed both palms together, as if in ritual thanksgiving. The occult researcher felt a brief shift. Suspicion moved into determination. He tightened the satchel strap and rose. At the top of the stairs, the temple warden called one last time. "Occult researcher." "You will answer for any breach," he replied. "Temple warden." "I will answer only to truth and to evidence." The warden spat a sound that might have been contempt. They left the vaults sealed as the city breathed above them, unaware of the corded oath that had closed them off for the night. The occult researcher walked with the acolyte along collapsed archways back toward the surface. Every step produced the scrape of loose stone and the occasional drip of distant water. He kept his lamp low and his profile narrow. At the courtyard edge, he paused and touched the scorched folio he had carried up earlier. He placed his thumb where he had scraped ash along the page edge and watched the slight uplift of damaged ink. He had a rubbing fair enough to show the ritual name and the archivist's sand. He folded it into his grimoire and shut the cover. The memory of that first scrape, letters that refused to stay black, gave his next choice weight. He hid the smuggled fragments in a seam beneath his coat. He and the acolyte parted ways by a crumbled colonnade. The acolyte walked toward the river, while the occult researcher lingered to watch the sky turn toward faint light. He heard the distant approach of claimants and felt the inevitability of morning procedures press against the sealed night. Before dawn, he snapped the iron key back into the satchel, wrapped the confession in oilcloth, and listened as a distant bell marked the arrival of claimants at the vault stair. He had failed to read the ledger fully, but he had preserved proof that a mission had been chosen. That proof would be the work for the next chapter, to show not only that the city erased its truth, but why they had chosen to let absence stand as law. The corridor mouth closed behind him with the sound of a stone settling, and in that single, precise noise the night's decisions became material. He seized a wrist as a scraping noise stopped. The young acolyte winced and the cloth tore a hairline across a thumb. Suspicion tightened his jaw before he allowed his hand to loosen. Suspicion had sharpened his nights since the burned ledger in the courtyard. He did not begin with questions. He began with an accusation. "Why are you rubbing the page?" The occult researcher. The acolyte jerked his head back. I thought. The courtyard floor was cold under the occult researcher's boots. Lantern smoke curled between the fallen columns and an altar stone leaned on its side. He took in the acolyte's hands. Blackened fingernails, a smear of ash on the wrist, a bent stylus clutched like a weapon. The action told him more than a confession. He had come to the shrine after the burned ledger was found 2 nights earlier. He had seen the scorch marks, felt the burn, cold of pages that should have been charred to nothing. He had seen the wax seal with the outline of a book, remembering the lintel that cracked beneath his iron bar when he opened the vault. Those moments were not distant facts, they were tools now, evidence to be used. The young acolyte swallowed, it won't hold. "The letters fade when I touch them." Occult researcher narrowed his eyes and nodded once. He let go of the wrist and stepped back 3 paces. He moved toward the ledger the acolyte had been working on, bent to read the page edge, and used the thumb of his left hand to pull the cloth away. The cloth smelled of oil and incense. Under the rag, a faint impression showed where ink had been scraped clean. Suspicion pushed him forward. He measured the scrape with the brass monocle on its chain, then closed the grimoire at his waist and lifted his head, "Show me the key pockets," he instructed. The acolyte moved, fingers trembling. "I kept the stub here," I thought. He produced a tiny wax-sealed stub, the seal broken but the leather stub intact. The occult researcher recognized the sigil pressed into the wax, a bracketed cipher used by the council to mark ritual instruments. The stub sat in the acolyte's palm like an accusation. Outside the courtyard, a shadow detached itself from the temple wall. A voice came, flat and controlled. "What are you doing to the ledger?" Councillor Merrick stepped forward with two other figures at his back. He carried the weight of office even in this ruin. A ring flashed at his thumb. Merrick, the occult researcher. He kept his voice steady. He was erasing ink. Merrick's mouth tightened. "We ordered the vault resealed." "No work tonight." He looked past the acolyte to the ledger on the altar. "Bring it." The young acolyte hugged his shoulders in. "I found the impression, sir. You are to keep things safe." I thought. "You thought to prove what?" snapped a woman who had stepped from shadow, her voice thin and precise. She carried a frayed cord and an iron key like a talisman. "You thought to prove the book lies." He watched them. He catalogued the way Merrick set his jaw, the sharp tilt of the woman's chin, the acolyte's quick withdrawal. This was not a simple theft. This was a test of custody. Merrick's hand went to the stub in the acolyte's palm. "Give it to me." The acolyte balked. He looked at the occult researcher. "Please," he said. "Please don't let them take it." Suspicion slid into anger along a narrow ridge. The occult researcher felt the change in his chest like the cold clamp of a vise. He had come to observe. That plan dissolved when a living counselor reached for the ritual instrument. He stepped between Merrick and the acolyte. "Merrick," he said, and used the name like a measurement. "You will not confiscate evidence without record." Merrick's eyes narrowed. "And you will not make law from the courtyard steps. Give the stub. Show your warrant." The occult researcher kept his tone low so the acolyte could breathe. He forced the word warrant into the room like a simple lever. Merrick laughed once, a dry sound. "The council's warrant is in the vault. If you wish to see it, you will fetch the key from the archivist." He spat the last word. The occult researcher remembered the wax disc he had pried from the lintel. He remembered the seal stamped with a book that did not exist. He remembered the burned ledger 2 nights earlier and the way letters rose faint and then receded when he pressed his thumb to them. Those were not memories alone. They were evidence that whoever controlled access controlled truth. "Then fetch it," he said. "Open the catalogue." "I'll verify the stub." Merrick's jaw worked. He glanced at the woman with the iron key. "The vault is sealed." "You will not open it here." The acolyte's hand went to his mouth. He swallowed. "If they reseal the passages, the impressions will vanish." An exchange followed that contained both accusation and bargain. The occult researcher could taste the shift in air. He heard the counselor's voice move from command into negotiation. "You will bring a witness." "Merrick, you will not publish what you find." "I will bring no silence from you," the occult researcher replied. The woman with the key stepped forward. "You would jeopardize rights for curiosity?" she asked. "I would not let a living right erase evidence while you claim custody," he answered. They argued without raising their voices to a dangerous pitch. Lines were traded like blades. At one point the acolyte burst. "You can be trusted, Merrick." "You burned the ledger once." Merrick struck the table with his palm. "Do not say that name here." The confrontation broke into motion. Merrick signaled to his people. They moved like men closing ranks. The occult researcher made a decision that shifted the night. He reached into his satchel, pulled out the brass monocle case, and revealed the grimoire's index. He flipped to a catalogue entry and showed Merrick the burned ledger's registration. Location, previous custodians, and the wax disc stamp. The paper was real, the ink practical. Merrick stared. "Where did you get that?" "From the registry room." The occult researcher. "Where I found the empty shelf?" The woman with the iron key hissed. "You broke the seal." He did not answer. He could not give away his method. Instead he pointed to the ledger on the altar. "Open the page." "Watch me." The occult researcher took the stylus the acolyte had been using and pressed it to the margin. He scraped once, then held the cloth at the edge. A faint grey line appeared where the ink had been. The acolyte's breath hitched. The woman said, "We sealed those pages to protect the right, or to hide a choice." The occult researcher, "What I want to know is which." Merrick stepped closer. "You will not be the judge. The council will decide." "The council is not here, Merrick. The council cannot be summoned while they bury a truth. This ledger is public record." His words opened a new fissure. The other councilmen looked at one another. The acolyte's fingers tightened around the stub. A small hand-held lamp fell from a sconce. Its oil ignited a flare of orange that threw everyone into high contrast. At that flare, a figure slipped from the shadow of a ruined arcade and stood framed by an arch. He wore a threadbare monastic robe with ritual stitching and carried a leather ledger bound in wax. The silent archivist's fingers were ink-stained. He held a brass key on a frayed cord. The air changed again. The occult researcher felt the emotion shift beneath his skin. Suspicion moved into a wary curiosity, then into a cold calculation. He had expected the archivist to be gone or dead. Instead, the archivist had returned at the exact second the council debated custody. The archivist's voice was thin. "You will not open that book tonight," he said. "Archivist, Merrick, relieved, we will reseal." "The ledger is emptied already." The silent archivist looked past Merrick at the ledger on the altar. His fingers went to the wax-sealed ledger at his chest and rubbed at the seal with the tips of his ink-stained fingers. He did not look at the counselor when he spoke. "Emptying is a ritual," he said. "It is not accident." The occult researcher forced his face into stillness. "Show me." The archivist turned the leather stub over in his hand. He moved slowly and deliberately to a niche set into the plaster where a shuttered lamp hung. He set the wax-sealed ledger on the altar, and with a small iron tool peeled away a thin row of wax until the leather beneath showed. He opened to a page and used his thumb to trace a line that had been scraped smooth. The reconstruction that followed felt like a demonstration. The archivist's hands were precise. He smudged a margin with his ink-stained fingertip, then used a small bone stylus to press a sigil into the page's edge. As he worked, the occult researcher read the acts as evidence. The archivist's mouth pursed at certain letters, his eyes darted to the altar, and at one point he sealed a page in wax and placed it in a niche. The occult researcher did not claim to see the past. He saw the archivist's choices. "You chose to remove ink," he said finally. The archivist's shoulders rose. "I chose to protect the living." "Protect by erasing?" the acolyte asked. The archivist's thumb rubbed at his temple where a thin scar bisected the skin. He looked at the acolyte and the counselors. "Pages die if the right is failed. Some words kill more than fire." He the sentence with a level mouth. Argument erupted again, sharper and faster. The woman with the key accused the archivist of hiding. Merrick accused the occult researcher of sedition. The acolyte accused Merrick of burning pages himself in past council orders. Voices rose. At one point, 3 lines of speech collided in quick staccato. "You sealed the ledger!" The acolyte cried. "You dragged the vault open." Merrick shot back. "We follow the ritual code," the woman said. The occult researcher counted beats, then pushed for a decisive act. He demanded the archivist produce the brass key whose teeth were filed into an occult cipher. The archivist hesitated, then took the iron key on his cord and produced a second smaller brass key from a hidden fold within his robe. He held it out flat. The teeth had been filed into a pattern not of letters, but of ritual intervals. The occult researcher recognized the pattern as a mechanism rather than a text. Whoever possessed the key could set the right. The right carried meaning in motion, not ink. For the first time, the counselors looked alarmed. They had assumed the ledger itself was the medium of truth. The brass key proved otherwise. The civilization had encoded its pivotal truth into ritual mechanics. That realization shifted power. Merrick moved to snatch the key. The occult researcher put up a hand. "We will test it in the catalog room." Merrick refused. "We will not expose the right. You will hand the key to the council." The acolyte stepped between them. "You will not reseal it." "I will hide it until someone decides honestly." Merrick grabbed for the key. The acolyte twisted. They struggled. The corridor echoed with the sound of bodies against stone. A sconce was broken. Dust fell. The occult researcher lunged, fingers seeking the key, but a councilman struck his shoulder with the flat of his palm. The shove knocked him to the floor. He tasted grit. He watched Merrick pin the acolyte's arm and retrieve the key. The archivist made a small motion with his inked fingers and then moved to lay his palm flat on the open ledger. The act was precise. His thumb rubbed a page, pressed a sigil in melted wax, then drew the stub into his robe and folded the ledger closed as if the book itself resisted being read. That was the mid-chapter turn. The key left the acolyte's grip and the ledger was closed, but the occult researcher saw the archivist's hand hesitate at the seam. The pause contained meaning. He rose, brushing grit from his coat. "Stop," he said. "You will not reseal the passage without record. You will not remove the key from the public sphere." His voice held an edge now that suspicion had become determination. Merrick's men forced the corridor into a ring. The vault approach began to tremble with sudden urgency as the councillors debated a reseal. The woman with the iron key whispered to Merrick. They conferred. The archivist stood with his back straight and did not speak. The occult researcher moved fast. He slid his hand into the archivist's sleeve as if to steady him and palmed the brass key in the same motion. It was a thief's maneuver without theater. The archivist did not jerk. He let his hand close around the occult researcher's fingers for a second, pressing inked skin to skin. The gesture was not gratitude. It was an agreement. Merrick's hand closed on the archivist's shoulder. He turned. "What did you do?" "Give me the key." The occult researcher held the key in his fist and hoped his pulse did not show. He knew the next moments would determine custody. He felt the emotion shift again. Anger melted into fear, then resolved into a steady resolve. He slid the key into his palm and concealed it beneath his coat. A fight broke out as Merrick's men moved to force the vault closed. The corridor's stone cracked under boots. The acolyte ducked, then slipped through a broken arch with the stub clutched to his chest. The archivist made no move to pursue him. Merrick barked, "Stop him." The acolyte vanished into the pre-dawn shadow. The occult researcher pushed through the press of bodies, trying to catch sight of the small figure. He missed him by a heartbeat. The acolyte had already disappeared into a service stair. At the vault threshold, the archivist set the ledger on the floor, pulled a strip of wax from his robe, and sealed the seam again. He placed the brass key on top of the seal, and then let someone from Merrick's party clamp a fresh wax disc over it. The council moved with mechanical efficiency. The vault door was dragged shut, stones shifted, a heavy iron bar slid into a groove. He forced himself to remain calm while the seal rose like a final curtain. When the bar slid, the occult researcher felt adrenaline recede into cold. He had not prevented the seal, but he had removed a single small artifact from the council's custody. A charred fragment he had palmed during the scuffle and tucked against his ribs. The fragment was black at one edge and showed a line of ink that still glowed faintly beneath soot. They left the vault resealed, and the ledger apparently emptied. They marched out under a pale sky threaded with dawn. The occult researcher walked beside the silent archivist for a short stretch. The archivist did not look at him. He rubbed his ink-stained fingertips where they had touched the key and then opened his mouth. "You smuggled a fragment," the archivist said quietly. "It may be the only trace left," the occult researcher replied. The archivist's breath came out like a small wind. "If it names a person, burn it. If it names a right, bury it. If it names an obligation, share it with those who can hold it without killing a village." The occult researcher folded the fragment into wax paper and slid it deeper into his satchel. He felt the weight of choice. He could reveal it and force the council into crisis. He could hand it to an outside authority and watch the city split open. He could burn the piece and let the omission remain. He looked up. Councillor Merrick's shoulders had square lines now, his men forming a wall behind him. The acolyte was gone. At the edge of the courtyard a small glyph was scratched in the dust, where the acolyte had fallen in the scuffle. It looked like an abbreviated sigil, a promise or a vow. He photographed it with the brass monocle and felt the image stick in his head like talk to leather. Later, in a makeshift camp beneath a collapsed colonnade, he sat with the young acolyte who had returned unseen. The acolyte's eyes were rimmed red. He kept saying the same short thing in halting speech. They took the key. They think paper is gone. The acolyte's hands kept worrying the stub in his cloak. They sealed the vault because they feared the relic, the occult researcher. He set the charred fragment on the stone between them, uncovered just long enough for both to see the faint line of ink. They bent over it. The occult researcher held the monocle and traced the line with a steady finger. The glyph beneath the suit waited. He felt a small, hot shudder of clarity. The civilization had engineered a mission. They had set a ritual that would unwrite a truth if performed. The ledger was only a prop. The key and the right were the mechanism. The acolyte broke the silence. Why would they do that? The occult researcher gave a measured answer. Because some truths end communities if left written. They chose a mission to survive a single danger. The acolyte's face tightened. Then they hid it from everyone. They hid it from most. Not all. He tapped the charred edge and felt a tiny shard of ink flake into his palm. He wrapped it in cloth and whispered its catalogue entry into the grimoire index he kept in his coat. They made decisions in practical terms. The occult researcher resolved to follow the acolyte's trace to the catalogue room, to the registry shelf where the ledger had disappeared, and to the small niches where the archivist had pressed wax. He would test the key's cipher by finding its patterned teeth in other instruments. He would not publish until he understood the ritual logic. He would not let the council own the truth alone. They left the camp before the sun cleared the ruined colonnades. The vault lay sealed behind the council's closed ranks. The occult researcher slid the charred fragment into the satchel beneath his coat and moved as if he intended to return it to its place. Only he kept the brass key warm against his ribs until the stone door ground another seal into place. At the stair top he paused, looked back once at the vault's dark seam, and then walked away with the writer's steady step. The archivist watched him go and made a small notation on the wax disc left on the threshold. The notation was a tiny living glyph, one the occult researcher could not yet read. He felt its presence like a promise. The chapter ended on the narrow action of departure. The occult researcher closed his hand around the satchel strap and descended into the city's alleys. The charred fragment hot against his chest, and the knowledge that the ledgers as a mission had been deliberate pressing his spine. He would pursue the key, the ritual, and the meaning of the erased line. He would not let the omission stand unchallenged. He scraped ash from a charred folio and watched a single stroke of ink lift beneath his thumb. Suspicion tightened the set of his shoulders and steadied the hand that held the manuscript. The occult researcher kept his throat quiet and his breathing measured. The immediate problem lay bare. The ledger would not keep its words unless something in its making allowed them to be pulled away. He had come to read, not to witness a book that erased itself while he touched it. He looked up. The courtyard wind pushed burnt leaves along the flagstones, and the young acolyte waited with a strap of leather in his hands. The acolyte's name was Maro. He kept his head low and held the lamp so the researcher could see the faint remnant of a glyph where the ash resisted. Maro, the researcher said. And his voice was low. Hold the lamp closer. Maro moved the lamp and his fingers trembled when the light warmed the page. Suspicion shaped the researcher's first moves. He pressed a fingertip across the faint line and felt a dry resistance, like silk caught on a burr. He had seen fire-damaged manuscripts before. They blistered, flaked, or charred into unreadable ribs. These letters performed differently. They recoiled. That recoil made the question concrete. Whoever had erased this ledger had used method, not accident. He thought back to the courtyard blaze that he had catalogued 2 days earlier. The burned ledger in the courtyard had not been wholly consumed. He had already found letters that blurred, only to return black when chilled. Now the folio he held refused to remain written upon. The sealed vault, the empty folios, the lintel door with the stamped wax disc, each discovery from earlier journeys threaded into the same pattern. The problem was not isolated, it was procedural. He set the folio upon the tarred table and motioned Maro to kneel. His hands worked quickly. A brass monocle into place, The grimoire opened to his notes. An obsidian signet ring tapped against the table to check for vibrations. Marrow. "Fetch the sealing wax from my satchel," he said. Marrow moved, and the courtyard air smelled of ash and the cold iron of hinges. The researcher spoke aloud the steps he would try. He did so to keep the movements precise and the acolyte present. "I will test a counter right on the edge, then compare it with the tablet we found under the flagstones." He named the tablet. It had been pried loose 2 nights before and bore a partial cipher, saying the tablet's presence made the hunt a laboratory task, not a seance. The researcher's suspicion shifted into cautious urgency. An uneasy urgency took him past hesitation. He could not leave the folio to its private erasure. He pressed a measured compound of oil and chalked the page in a thin strip and began the counter gesture he had copied from a marginal note in the burned ledger. The ink under his thumb flared, then faded. The ritual failed this time. The letters lifted and dispersed like dust under a fingertip. He hissed once and Marrow, "Did it work, sir?" The researcher did not answer immediately. He was already recalibrating. That recalibration pushed him toward the sealed vault, where the silent archivist waited. He checked the lintel and found the brittle seal he had cracked earlier. The wax impression of a closed book lay in his palm like a small accusation. The vault opened with a rasp of stone. Inside, the archivist stood by empty shelves, hands folded over a leather ledger that had been replaced with gaps. The archivist's presence changed the tenor of the room. The silent archivist did not move quickly. She had the practiced economy of someone who measured the weight of every step. Her ink-stained fingertips trembled when she lifted her spectacles and looked at the researcher. "You should not have come this far," she said. Her voice was a thin rasp with precise consonants. Suspicion shifted again, this time into accusation. The researcher tightened his grip on the waxed disc and asked, "Why were the shelves cleared? Who ordered the empty folios?" His sentence held accusation as an action. The archivist tilted her head and wiped her thumb across her lip, leaving a faint smear of old ink. "Orders come from the council," she replied. "Not all orders are carried by name." Her eyes flicked to the alcove where blank folios were stacked like patient graves. The room smelled faintly of damp stone and sealing wax. The archivist moved with a motion he had seen before. The reversal of carrot, that small gesture she used to indicate erasure rather than preservation. She led them down a narrow passage into an alcove, where shelves were populated by blank folios and ritual implements. She set a brass ruler down and tapped it against the smooth edge of an empty page, as if demonstrating how the paper had been prepared to refuse ink. Her demonstration was a physical explanation. The folios had been scraped, oiled, and treated so script would not bind. They learned to make pages that would not keep words, she said. Her phrase was spare. The fact of that craft changed the ledger from a victim of fire into a controlled instrument. Marrow examined the folios and turned to the researcher. "This is deliberate," he said. "Someone taught a process." The researcher nodded and said, "They taught many hands." "The question is why." He traced the surface of a treated page and found a faint residue of a mineral powder. The mineral could be dated and sourced. The hunt shifted from preservation to provenance. In the subchamber beneath flagged stones, Marrow pried a loose slab and gasped. Concrete action produced a concrete object, a sealed tablet inlaid with a partial cipher. He carried it up, and the researcher wiped sweat from his upper lip with the back of his hand. The tablet's etched marks shifted under the lamp, as if refusing to be read from one angle and revealing a different set of strokes from another. The researcher felt a sudden lurch of possibility. If the ledger destroyed vertical continuity, the tablet might have encoded the ledger's intent horizontally. The discovery rewired their plans. The researcher set the tablet against the ledger and began a slow comparison. He read aloud a single glyph, and Marrow echoed it. The archivist closed her eyes for a moment as if hearing a sound from elsewhere. "The tablet is not a key in the ordinary sense," she said finally. "It is a root. It points to where the truth would be held, but not to the words themselves." Her voice carried a fracture of loyalty that the researcher had not expected. That fracture became the first twist. The archivist had been trusted, and now she appeared to hold secrecy by choice. The researcher confronted her. You preserved nothing. You allowed absence. Why? He spoke fast, each word a chosen tool. The archivist looked at the ceiling, at a relief of a council seal half obscured by soot. We were warned. The ledger's truth would unravel the city if released, she said. The council voted to remove it. They expected us to make forgetting practical. Her breath came in thin pulls. The researcher felt anger replace urgency. They argued in clipped lines. The council voted. The researcher demanded who in the council, who signed that removal. He pressed. The archivist's hands moved. She set the leather-bound object she still carried, an empty sealed ledger, on the table and drew the iron key on its frayed cord from her robe. Not all names survive in paper, she said. Some names survive in decisions. We obeyed to prevent a worse ruin. The researcher leaned forward and said, Maro, read the relief. Say the councillor's name aloud. Maro readers' required names were carved in low relief. He stammered through the syllables, each one another layer of confirmation. The researcher's suspicion sharpened into a demand for accountability. You made the ledger unreadable, and you consecrated that unreadability. You are an agent of erasure, he said. He kept his sentences short and concrete. The archivist answered with a single action. She reached into her robe, withdrew a damp cloth, and rubbed at the ledger until smudges of ink dissolved. The cloth took the letters. The action was both confession and ritual. Words began to fail and actions took over. The researcher moved to the central table with the manuscript and the tablet and began to lay out implements. He used a calibrated lamp, a small iron stylus, and his bone-handled tool to trace over hidden grooves. He spoke while he worked in clipped commands so Maro and the archivist could follow his method. Keep your hands steady. If the glyph dissolves, stop the motion and note the moment. The machine of investigation hummed. They tested the tablet against the ledger and found a ritual fail, safe. The ledger resisted recovery. Any attempt to read the ledger in full caused a chemical reaction in the folio's treated surface, turning glyphs into ash at a microscopic rate. When the researcher placed a replicating ink along a scraped groove, the ink beaded then vanished into a charred halo. The counter-right would require a precise inverse motion. Otherwise, words would combust into particulate and be lost entirely. This discovery forced a choice. Attempt restoration and risk complete loss, or preserve enforced silence and record only what their instruments could salvage. The researcher hesitated. He looked at the archivist and then at Maro. He felt the emotion change again. What had begun as suspicion moved into urgency, and then into an ache of responsibility. He had trained to save words from oblivion. The ledger presented him with a paradox. Restoration might annihilate the only surviving hints. Maro spoke with the bluntness of someone who preferred action to conjecture. We must try a counter, right? If there is a way to hold the words, I want to see it, the researcher answered. We will attempt a partial hold, not full restoration. We will photograph and encode, not read aloud. He arranged tethered glass plates to capture ink residue at high magnification. The physical work kept the debate from becoming only words. As they readied the plates, the silent archivist moved away and positioned herself by the altar, like clearing at the vault center. Her hands were steady now. Her breathing had a cadence honed by years of ritual motion. She produced a set of sealing implements and set them beside the ledger and the tablet. The researcher watched her set the iron key into a ring of cold stone and felt the slow mounting of dread. What are you doing? He asked. The archivist did not answer immediately, her eyes fixed on the ledger as if viewing a wound. Then she spoke in a near whisper. This ledger must be sealed again. The council's vote survived because of a catastrophe we still understand only in fragments. I will perform the rite to make the ledger blank and irreversible. Her words landed like a decision taken long beforehand. The researcher opened his mouth and found his protests turned to practical questions. They traded rapid lines. Archivist, stop that. The researcher said, Custodian, you cannot destroy what little we can measure. The archivist answered, we already destroyed much. We are not destroying words now. We are preventing a repeat, Maro interjected in a higher register. You made us complicit if you do this without telling us. Marrow will not stand for burning what could help us warn others. The exchange tightened. There were 2 to 6 short exchanges like this, each one clipped and urgent, before the tension snapped into motion. The archivist began the sequence. A measured scrape of wax, a muted bell struck 3 times, a slow turning of the iron key within a stone socket. Her hands moved in a practiced economy. She pressed a heated iron to the ledger's spine, and the leather stiffened, blackened, and began to shrink. The researcher lunged, grabbing the archivist's wrist. The metal on her finger was warm. He, "Stop!" And the single-syllable command was a physical attempt to alter motion. She jerked back with a reflex born of years of public obedience, but did not release the iron. Her mouth formed words he could not hear. He tried to wrench the iron free, and Marrow grabbed his elbow. The archivist's eyes were wet but set. "Do you want what happened before to return?" she said. "Do you want the ledger's truth to open the chamber of doves again?" She the name as if speaking of a place with a known consequence. The researcher heard a new detail in that name and felt the narrative bend. Counselor Shadow, the relief, and now the chamber of doves. These were not abstract evocations, they were reference points. He demanded specifics. "Tell me the chamber of doves. Tell me what occurred there and who died." The archivist's fingers tightened on the iron. "They buried a pact there," she said. The ledger spoke a binding clause in a council ritual. Those words rewired law. They made certain people immune and others disposable. We could not let that repeat. Her voice was a fracture between duty and confession. The twist slid into place. The ledger's erasure had been sanctioned to prevent a social instrument, text, as law, from being resurrected and used to bind people again. The researcher had assumed preservation always served knowledge. Here preservation threatened people. That moral complication forced him to revise his goals. He could not be only a rescuer of texts. He tried another route. He reached for the tablet and read aloud a partial cipher while Marrow recorded each syllable. They repeated the sequence, each time moving the lamp to different angles and noting how a particular glyph revealed a different shading. The researcher felt a clarity settle. The ledger's fail-safe reacted to full reading, but partial, patterned exposures could be captured without triggering combustion. They could harvest the ledger's echoes rather than restore the ledger wholesale. The ritual of final sealing accelerated. The archivist began a sequence of sealing gestures across the ledger's leaves, and with each motion the edges flaked into ash that smelled of iron and old glue. The researcher called out specific stops and Marrow obeyed with precise movements. The archivist answered with single-sentence lines. "I will not let history kill again," she said. Her sentence was both justification and sorrow. They argued through action. The researcher pressed his palm to the ledger and tried to shield the pages while Marrow held a glass plate to catch microscopic particles. The archivist sang a low, memorized cadence and the ledger's surface peeled away like scorched skin. Their short sentences clipped into one another. "Stop, we cannot seal it differently. We already sealed." The exchange ran 5 rapid turns, and then the central table became a locus of noise. Metal on stone, the soft crackle of collapsing fiber, and the whisper of recorded syllables. At the ritual's peak the ledger produced a small, dense combustive flare, and a corner of the tablet she carried fractured, revealing a ghost glyph that glowed faintly in the lamplight before dimming. The room went quiet except for the scratch of Marrow's notes. For a moment the researcher thought he could hear the last sound of the ledger's writing dissolving into voice. The archivist's hand moved to tamp the flame and the researcher saw, in the set of her jaw, the finality of the act. When the smoke cleared, they inspected what remained. The ledger's readable surface had become a bed of hard black crust and locked stone. The tablet's cipher had separated into a smattering of etched chips. The researcher sifted through the ash with gloved fingers and found a single charred fragment no larger than a fingernail. A ghost glyph remained, a looped sign with a diagonal burn through its center. Marrow reached for the fragment and faltered. "Give it here," the researcher said. Marrow handed it over with both hands. The researcher set it on his grimoire, closed the book a small fraction, and then opened to a prepared pocket where he could store the shard. He did not speak. The act of pocketing the glyph became the new resolution. They had resolved the chapter's central conflict. The ledger would not be restored whole, and the archivist had enacted the ritual she and the council had sanctioned. But resolution did not equal agreement. The researcher looked at the archivist and said, "You chose to make us accomplices. You chose the method and the timing." He kept the sentence as concrete accusation. She swallowed, "And you chose to come and watch the outcome," she replied. Their exchange was blunt and complete. In the aftermath, the courtyard light tilted to dawn and the ash on the flagstones cooled. The researcher wrapped the fragment in oilcloth and slid it into his leather grimoire's inner pocket. He wrote a single line into his field ledger. Surviving glyph preserved, context incomplete. He stamped the page with a tiny seal so he could trace provenance later. The act of writing the inventory, not the ledger's content, became his ethical choice. He spoke to Marrow then, choosing steps that would shape what they did next. "Marrow, catalogue everything we did tonight. Date each plate and note every stop in the ritual. The city must have a record, even if it cannot know the ledger's words." Marrow nodded and began listing tools and times allowed, each entry a small, concrete act that would stitch together future accountability. The archivist moved to the linteled door and set the wax disc back into place. She inserted the iron key, turned it, and the lock set with a dull click. She did not look at the researcher when she did it. She walked away down the vault passage with the ledger binding under her arm, leaving a faint trail of ash. The researcher followed at a measured distance. He caught one last look at the archivist before she closed the door. Her shoulders were drawn inward, and her ink-stained fingertips left a faint smudge on the lintel. He felt an inward shift from accusation to comprehension. Suspicion had become an understanding that duty could be a form of harm. He did not forgive her. He catalogued decisions. Outside the vault in the ash-strewn courtyard, the researcher laid the tiny fragment on the table and studied it under the monocle. The glyph's burned diagonal revealed a small alteration in the stroke pattern that implied an insertion point, an instruction to remove rather than add. He copied the stroke precisely into his field ledger, pen moving in short, precise lines. Each mark he made was an interpretation anchored to a physical act. He closed his grimoire with the fragment inside, set the brass monocle into his pocket, and held the researcher's posture steady. He had resolved the immediate conflict of whether to restore or preserve. He had not resolved the deeper moral question of authority. That question would follow him beyond the vault's stone. Before he left Marrow, who will hold the record now, the researcher looked at him and replied, "We will. We will hold accountable what we can record. We will not recreate what harms. We will test and publish what is safe to publish." His words were decisions expressed through clearly stated actions. To catalogue, to test, and to publish selectively. They were practical commitments. As dawn filtered through the charred colonnades, the researcher walked out of the courtyard with the grimoire at his hip. He carried the fragment in a pocket close to his chest. He felt exhaustion and a cold clarity in his limbs. He had come looking for a truth that an entire civilization had refused to archive. He left with a different burden: to preserve the evidence of a mission and to name who had chosen it. He placed the grimoire on his lap in the first cab he could find and opened it to the page where he had drawn the glyph. He set the small fragment onto the inked loop and photographed it slowly, 4 angles, a note beside each image. He dated every photograph. Each photograph was a restrained act of defiance against enforced forgetting. At the end of the morning, he presented his inventory to the municipal registrar with a sealed note and a list of witnesses. He did not speak of motives or the Chamber of Doves in public. He supplied facts: the wax disc, the iron key, the ash sample, the fragment. The registrar took the items with precise bureaucratic motions and recorded their receipt in a ledger that would remain separate from the destroyed ledger. The researcher watched the registrar close that ledger and felt the weight of small bureaucratic closure. He returned at dusk to his study, set the grimoire on his desk, and placed the charred fragment into a carved wooden box. He locked the box with the archivist's iron key, which he had kept, and slid both under a false floorboard. The final act of the chapter was concrete. A small box locked under a floorboard, the key catched in his coat. He had not restored the ledger. He had preserved what he could measure and arranged for accountability. He did not write a grand statement. He wrote procedural entries and set dates for chemical analysis, for cross-referencing with the municipal registrar, and for testimony scheduling. Documentation, not rhetoric, became his form of closure. He accepted that some truths, when unbarred, had caused harm, and that his duty now was to name and limit harm, while recording the steps others had taken to prevent it. The day ended with one concrete event, a knock at his study door. He opened it to find the silent archivist on the threshold. She had returned without the ledger. Her eyes met his and she held out a sealed cloth. "One thing remained on the altar," she said, "a token I could not burn." "I thought you should have it." He took the cloth with 2 hands and unfolded it. Inside lay a small brass pin stamped with the councillor's seal. He looked at the pin and then at the archivist. "You could have left it where it belonged," she answered. "I could not. Keep it. Use it when the time comes to call them to account." Her sentence carried neither plea nor triumph. The act of passing the pin transferred agency. That exchange completed the chapter's moral arc. A guardian of erasure became an accomplice in documentation. He pocketed the pin alongside the fragment and felt the story close into a set of pragmatic tasks: analysis, testimony, controlled dissemination. The ledger's last ritual had altered their course. The researcher had not restored the ledger's final truth, but he had preserved a trace big enough to challenge the council's silence. He would not erase the act of erasure. He lit a single candle in his study, set the grimoire before him, and placed the sealed wooden box beside it. He did not speak of destiny or new beginnings. He wrote one final sentence into his field ledger, fragment retained, a mission catalogue. Counsel implicated, he then closed the book and, with the fragment sealed beneath the floorboard and the brass pin in his pocket, he left the light on and walked into the cold morning with the burden of evidence and the plan to name the omission publicly when the proper safeguards were in place. He had reached a conclusion. The ledger's last ritual had been deliberate, sanctioned, and enacted to spare the city an earlier catastrophe. The archivist had chosen duty over disclosure, and in the moment of sealing, she had transformed from custodian to executioner of a mission. The immediate conflict had been resolved through concrete acts: the sealing, the salvage, the cataloguing, and the transfer of a council seal. The chapter closed not with rhetoric, but with locked boxes, signed receipts, and a single charred glyph folded into his grimoire. Outside, the city continued its ordinary motions. A cart creaked along the lane, a bell rang somewhere in the market. Inside, the researcher prepared the paperwork that would force the ledger's erasure into the light of accountable records. He had not restored the final truth. He had made the choice to preserve the evidence of omission instead, and to make that omission a traceable act. The morning bell sounded. He took the iron key from his pocket, pressed it to the small brass pin, and left the studio with the fragment secure at his side. The final paragraph is a concrete beat. He stepped into the street with the grimoire under his arm, the wooden box beneath his coat, and the brass pin visible in his palm as he turned the corner toward the municipal hall to file the ledger of omission.